Okay, I think we'll make a start. Might be one or two still joining us. Good evening and welcome to the second of 3 workshops looking at supporting athletes with fueling. And delighted to have good numbers of coaches again join us. I think as coaches, sometimes we spend a lot of time thinking about the technical sides and planning, training, etc. And sometimes we forget that for many athletes, we are the significant adult in their life, regardless of whether they're under 18 or older. And the topic we've been going to discuss tonight, problematic eating, is something you're going to come across as a coach with athletes if you coach for long enough and coach enough athletes. So hopefully by the end of these 3-week workshops, you'll feel more confident and able to support your athletes in this area. So great that you've joined us, and we've got fabulous. We've been able to work with Bodywhys and some Sport Ireland and some really good quality expertise to bring you these 3 workshops. I'm going to introduce Barry Murphy from Bodywhys to get the thing started.
Thank you very much, Matt, and good evening to everyone. My name is Barry Murphy and I'm the Communications Officer for Bodywhys, the Eating Disorder Association of Ireland. If you want to learn more about eating disorders, you can log on to www.bodywhys.ie. And our connection to this project started in October 2019. That's when we held our first meeting and we brought together a multidisciplinary group that has helped us to create this 3-part coach education series. I think if I've learned anything in this area over the past few years, I would say, be curious. Just listen to the person you're talking to. And that's just a simple 2 words I think we can all take away from any webinar I've been to as well. And I'm now going to hand you over to Dr. Siobhain McArdle, who's going to speak about tonight's topic. Siobhain's background is that she is a former NCAA athlete at 800 meters. She is currently a master's member of Raheny Athletics. She has a master's degree in sports science, a doctorate in sports psychology, a doctorate in counseling psychology. Her specialist area of interest is in eating disorders in sport, and she has worked with athletes and non-athletes across different settings, high performance, inpatient, and in residential settings. She is currently a clinical sports psychologist within the Sport Institute of Sport.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Barry. I just wanted to say thank you to the special interest group in sport that has been coordinated through Athletics Ireland and through Bodywhys, and for their input into what might be helpful this evening for coaches. I also want to thank Dr. Joanne Delahunt, who's based in Canada, and Dr. Ken Goss, who's based in the UK. I picked their brains as well in terms of what might be most helpful to you this evening, because I was struggling with that. As you can imagine, it's a big area. So I just wanted to be as helpful as I possibly could be this evening. So just to say that I'm going to be using Mentimeter this evening. So it'd be helpful if you had a laptop and a phone, because I'm going to be asking you to respond to a couple of questions. So I am going to try and limit how much information I share with you this evening, but I think I might go over an hour. And just so that if you have anything lined up for 9 o'clock on the telly, I'm flagging that to you now. And so after talking to you and presenting, I'm going to take some questions, and so you can then post your questions in the Q&A, and Barry and Matt might help me there with the questions. So I'm going to begin with asking you to go to Mentimeter. So if you have any problems seeing this, you could just put it in the Q&A or the comments. So I want you to go to www.menti.com and use the code 6493299 and respond to this question. As a coach, how do you feel about the topic of problematic eating behavior in athletes? Okay, so I'm just going to just sort of, I get a sense there of some of the feelings that you have around this topic. So what you've expressed, sorry, what you've expressed is quite a lot of anxiety, not quite sure in terms of how to approach the area. So I get a sense that it's something that for you is very important to learn more about. But I really get a sense of a lot of emotion around the area. So really this evening, what I'm hoping to do is improve your confidence in this area, your self-efficacy in terms of how to approach this area and your understanding of this area. So what I'm going to focus on is really trying to communicate to you a good understanding of problematic eating behavior in sport, how to recognize disordered eating, eating disorders in athletes, a good understanding of those factors that influence the development of disordered eating and eating disorders. So, what are the environmental factors in sport, in your training environment that could increase the risk of the development of an eating disorder, and what can you do? So if we begin by understanding eating behavior on a spectrum, and this is a lovely diagram that was produced by the Australian Institute of Sport to help us understand eating behavior. So on one end of the continuum, you have optimized nutrition. This is where the individual is eating in what we would call a more normal way, but optimizing their nutrition for both health and performance. And then as we move up that continuum, we're moving up the continuum into in terms of more problematic eating behavior. So what we might see is disordered eating, and then moving up the continuum even more, what we might see or what call clinical eating disorders. And I'll explain what I mean by those two terms in a moment. Now, in the first webinar, we really focused on low energy availability and how it underpins relative energy deficiency syndrome. And in that webinar, the point was made that you could have an athlete with low energy availability. So for those who were not at that first webinar, just quickly, low energy availability occurs when the individual is not consuming enough energy to meet the demands of basic bodily functions, day-to-day activity, and the demands of training. So their body is in an energy deficit. And if their body is in an energy deficit over a prolonged period of time, it has implications for many systems of the body. So for example, immune function, metabolic function, menstrual function, and it has implications for psychological health. But what was highlighted last week is that you could have low energy availability, but not necessarily disordered eating. So it could be that an individual is not consuming enough energy to meet the demands of performance, to keep their body ticking over in a healthy way, and to meet the demands of day-to-day activities, just because they don't realize, they're not informed around optimal nutrition practices. So there is something around education, but there is something around skill building. So eating for performance is a skill. So you can have somebody who's down at this end of the continuum, and what they just need some, education and skill building. It could be that somebody is in low energy availability and higher up the spectrum. So the reason for the low energy availability is that it's problematic eating behavior, but it's reflecting disordered eating. And I will explain what I mean by that in a minute. Or it could be that that low energy availability stems from a clinical eating disorder. So I'm going to be talking about problematic eating behavior this evening, but on this end of the continuum, where it isn't something that can be easily rectified through education and skill building. We're talking about more of a mental health difficulty. So disordered eating and eating disorders is what I'm going to be focusing on. So really, when we look at the use of language, it can be a bit of a red herring, eating disorder, because in an athlete who is struggling with disordered eating and eating disorder, this has as much to do with a negative and distorted opinion of themselves, high self-criticism, low self-worth, as with food and eating. So it is about eating, but it's about so much more. So when we think about disordered eating and eating disorders, sometimes we have, a picture in our head of who that is, but we do not know who is the individual who is experiencing disordered eating or a clinical eating disorder. So in front of us could be somebody who looks quite healthy, but they could have a clinical eating disorder. So you could have somebody who's going through extreme periods of restriction and low energy availability, and they have low body weight, or you could have somebody who has very high body weight and going through periods of extreme restriction. So just to say that disordered eating and eating disorders, we see it, across the ages from 8 to 80. We see them across males and females, and we see them in sport, across the sports and across competitive levels. So what are some of the more common problematic eating behaviors? So just for the purposes of this evening, I'm not going to cover every different permutation of disordered eating and eating disorder. I'm just going to be talking more in generalist terms, and it's not to diminish anybody's experience with disordered eating or an eating disorder. Just it's really more so to as a platform for education. So common patterns, restriction. So this is where the individual purposefully restricts the amount of energy that they are consuming. And we see this pattern of behavior in the clinical eating disorder of anorexia nervosa. We also have restriction and purging. So this is where the individual is restricting the amount of energy that's going into their body, but they're also trying to compensate for the energy that's going into their body. And the way that they compensate for that energy is what we call purging. So the purging behavior could be through exercise, it could be through vomiting, or it could be through laxatives and diuretics. But for the most part, in an eating disorder like anorexia nervosa, we see the purging in the form of exercise. We can have restriction, so restricting the amount of energy that's going in. And then restriction sets that individual up for binging. So binging, what does that term mean? So we can have what is called a subjective binge. So a subjective binge is where, you might hear, oh, at my lunch today, I had a bit of a binge. And when we explore that, they might have had a large piece of chocolate cake. So that would be called a subjective binge. An objective binge is where the individual is consuming a large objective quantity of food. So, it would be that if anybody actually looked at the quantity of food, it is a large, objectively large quantity of food. And it's typically consumed over a short period of time. And the individual would describe a sense of loss of control in the eating process. So that's an objective binge. And then after the objective binge, we have what is again called purging behavior. So that's compensating for the binge. And that can be through exercise, or vomiting, or laxatives or diuretics. And so we see this cycle of restriction, binging, and purging in a type of clinical eating disorder. So we can see this as in the form of disordered eating, but up further in the continuum in terms of clinical eating disorders in the form of bulimia nervosa. And then we have binging. So where the individual is consuming objectively large amounts of food, but they're not trying to compensate for that in any way. So there's no ensuing exercise behavior or vomiting behavior or laxatives or diuretics. So I suppose if you kind of think about that continuum, we could have restriction in the disordered eating part of the continuum, or we can have restriction up in the clinical eating disorder end of the continuum. So just in very broad strokes, what we see as you go up the continuum is increased frequency. So for example, you might have an athlete who restricts, binges, and purges perhaps, 2, 3, 4 times a year. That would be reflective of disordered eating. Or you have an athlete who has been restricting, binging, and purging for 6 months, on a daily basis, and we're moving into a clinical eating disorder. What we also see is that, when we have increased frequency of the symptoms, of the patterns, increased duration of the patterns, what we also have, and it makes sense, increased negative implications for physical and mental health. So there becomes, as the longer the patterns of behavior are in place, the more frequent they are, the more significant the psychological changes, and the more significant the physical changes. This is a very important, I'm going to be making a very important point in this slide, because this is not what people think about when they actually think about disordered eating and eating disorders. That we need to, when we are working with somebody, we aim to try and understand what is the function or context to the eating behavior. So an disordered eating behavior, problematic eating behavior, it develops functionally. It has a function, and the individual may not realize what that function is. But I'll give you some examples. So one of the most common one is a way of coping with painful emotions. So for example, if you have somebody a very low weight, or they're restricting, or they're in energy deficit, there is an increasing disconnect from emotions. Very low weight, you disconnect. The longer you restrict, and the more you restrict, the more numb you become. So you're not feeling. So it's a very effective way of dealing with difficult emotions. Or with binging and purging, it's a way of actually releasing a buildup of quite intense emotions. It's a very, for that individual, a very reliable way of dealing with anxiety or very difficult emotions. Or if we see in binging, a way of very soothing difficult emotions. So across the board, one of the functions of disordered eating and eating disorders is a way of coping with painful emotions. They can give the individual increased feelings of safety and security. So there's something that they can always come back to. So, I'm trying to cope, and I'm finding it all very overwhelming. I know I can go back to binging, purging. There will be a release there for me. Or I know that I always have this behavior to come back to. It's dependable. It's there for me. For some individuals, being in energy balance itself makes them feel quite agitated. They get a sense of calm from being in negative energy balance. Being highly controlled and having lots of rules around what you can eat, when you eat it, when you can't eat it, makes things feel more predictable and controlled. For some individuals, it's not necessarily around body weight and shape. It could be around around seeing the numbers come down. There's a sense of mastery and pride in what they can actually do. The numbers coming down, or maybe there's a sense of pride around keeping the body fat at a certain level. We also know that in society, the loss of weight or certain body shapes and sizes results in compliments, attention, or envy of others. And so where the individual is on that continuum, what it gives the individual is increased care from others. So maybe, for the first time in that individual, that young person's life, they feel like they're being listened to. For the first time, they're actually being heard. For the first time, people care about their well-being. And this is, it's a very important point, because we see eating disorders or disordered eating or problematic eating behavior as the problem. The young person, the athlete, in many ways, it's a solution for them. And it's a very important point to keep in mind. So what are some of the individual risk factors? So some of the factors that increase the risk of an eating disorder in sport can make the individual a great athlete. So we see that perfectionism, we see this personality trait very consistently in disordered eating behavior. But we also see this in very successful athletes. You know, high tolerance of pain. You need to have a high tolerance of pain to restrict to the extent that some individuals do as they move up that continuum. Very competitive. So, you know, sometimes we see the competitive drive in the athlete really wanting to perform very well. But we see that competitive drive also in terms of, you know, their body. You know, they want their body to look a certain way. They want to be the leanest person. So they're highly disciplined and controlled. You know, we love that in sport. And they also could have a very high athletic identity. So they very much identify with being the athlete. The athlete is who they are. And, you know, their sense of body shape and size is actually tied into that. There's also genetic risk factors. So there is some research to suggest that, you know, if there is an eating disorder in the immediate family or in the close family, the risk of developing an eating disorder for that individual can be up to 4 times greater. There's also biological risk factors. So we know that we're not exactly sure about the exact mechanisms, but puberty is a time of increased risk of the development of an eating disorder. You can see that in puberty, you know, the individual's body is changing. And so for the female, they're putting on increased body fat. So it is a window of vulnerability for the development of disordered eating. So we know that, you know, in terms of presentation, adolescence in itself, you know, that's a significant window of vulnerability for the presentation of disordered eating and eating disorders. If you're a female, you're probably we know that you're 2 to 3 times more likely to develop disordered eating or an eating disorder. So our Norwegian friends have done a huge amount of research in this area. I mean, they're just really, you know, they're on the forefront of this area looking at disordered eating and eating disorders in sport. And in a really huge study, the Norwegians compared, I think it was a sample of 450 athletes to 450 controls. And they showed that there's a way greater prevalence of disordered eating and eating disorders in athletes than in non-athletes. We also know that disordered eating and eating disorders are higher among elite athletes and those competing in weight-sensitive sports. So what do we mean by that? We mean, you know, sports where there might be, you might have to make weight, or where there's a competitive advantage to being a certain weight and size. So that could be in an aesthetic sport like gymnastics, or in gravitational sports such as high jump, you know, the power to weight ratio, or in endurance sports such as endurance running. We know it's higher in female than male athletes. And what the research shows is the prevalence is 0 to 19% in males, or 6 to 45% in females, depending on the study. So as Matt said, as starting us off, that if you have a group of 20 athletes, so high performance female athletes in endurance running, what the research is saying is that, you know, at least 9 of them at some point in their career will experience problematic eating behavior that is having implications for their psychological health and their physical health. So we know that only 5 to 15% of people with an eating disorder will seek help. And, you know, there is quite a lot of shame in this particular mental health difficulty, but there's quite a lot of times the individual doesn't believe that they have a difficulty. So, you know, it's hard for them to actually comprehend that they actually have a difficulty. It's lost in their whole identity and their personality. So it's very difficult for them to say, hey, you know, I've got a difficulty here and I think I might need some help. We also know that you are working with probably one of the most difficult populations to engage in support. So research that has looked in, you know, college-aged individuals in terms of who will avail of support. We know that athletes are less likely than non-athletes to avail of support, and male athletes the less likely. They are our hardest to reach population. This is important because clinical eating disorders have the highest rate of mortality of all mental health difficulties. So just to summarize that first section, you know, we can just to remember that eating behavior in sport is viewed on a spectrum. Adolescence is a peak time of vulnerability. In disordered eating, and that should be eating disorders, we need to understand there is a function or context to the behavior. I cannot emphasize that enough. In addressing the health and performance consequences, health has got to be the priority. So how can we recognize disordered eating behaviors in athletes? So we'll begin with the psychological signs. What we see is a growing preoccupation with food, calories, body shape, and weight. So the individual can tell you the caloric content of any food. You know, they talk about food, cooking, recipes all the time. So there's greater obsessionality around the numbers, around the amount of energy that's going in, the amount of energy that's going out. There's quite a lot of importance potentially placed on low body fat, so an aversion to increasing body fat. What we see is increased rigidity, thinking, and behaviors. One of the things that we see with disordered eating is that the individual's thinking becomes more and more rigid. So it becomes more and more black and white. Things are evaluated in black and white terms. So I either eat clean or I didn't. Now I can tell you, if I didn't, what happens? If I didn't, that triggers restriction, or it might trigger binging. So that's the lens the individual has. So I'm either eating clean or I'm not. I'm either performing well or I'm not. So it becomes more and more critical and more rigid and less flexible. So you see the individual starting to develop a lot of rules around what they can and what they can't eat, when they can eat, can't eat before 10, can't eat after a certain time, how they eat. A lot of shoulds there in terms of what they should eat, what they shouldn't eat, how they should exercise more. It gives you a sense of the thinking. Strong body image, dissatisfaction, and distortion. It's really hard, when you have somebody in front of you who's saying that they're really big, they feel very fat, they feel very overweight, and you're looking at this person and thinking, how are you perceiving that? But we know that there is a distortion, almost a disconnect. And in therapy, one of the things that we're trying to do is reconnect that individual with their body. I think this is a very important point for coaches. There's an increased difficulty in perceiving and interpreting physical signs. So it's called, the technical term is interoception. So what it means is that, as the individual's disordered eating increases, or it goes up that continuum, what happens is the individual loses more and more connection with their body. So it's almost like the individual is becoming almost tone deaf in terms of the signals their body's giving them. So it's very hard for them to identify, am I full, am I not full? Am I hungry, am I not hungry? Am I sore, am I not sore? Can I trust this? Can I trust this pain? Can I trust this fatigue? Maybe I can go on a little more. So when we think about disordered eating or problematic eating behavior, we're really thinking about, okay, there's not enough energy going into the individual. That is going to have huge physical implications and performance implications, psychological implications. But layered on top of that is that it's not this individual's fault, in that it's the disordered eating and the eating disorder that is creating more and more difficulty trusting the body and picking up the signals of the body. We also see changes in mental health. So decreases in mood, increases in anxiety. What are some of the behavioral signs? We might see changes in weighing behavior and increased comparisons with others. So maybe you don't see this. Maybe the family sees this. Sometimes what we see is the individual, the obsessionality, as it increases, we see the weighing behavior increase. We might see avoidance of social activities that involve eating. So you kind of notice that, the person is, you don't see them at breakfast, you don't see them at lunch, and, do they do their own dinner? So they're not engaging in family eating activities or social eating activities anymore. We see more and more cutting down or cutting out food groups, and this is relative or related to the rules. Reducing overall energy intake, more counting, measuring, and weighing food. So the scales are out, very particular about, the different macronutrients, micronutrients, a lot of counting, measuring, perhaps having a specific bowl, cups. So we see more obsessionality around eating behavior. You might not see this, but maybe their friends do. And Maybe their parents do. So going to the bathroom right after a meal, and that would be for purging or vomiting. I just want to emphasize that I'm highlighting lots of psychological signs and behavioral signs, and it's, you can't say that somebody has disordered eating or an eating disorder on the basis of one sign. We're looking at a constellation of signs. Okay? We're looking at, patterns. There's going to have a number of psychological signs, a number of behavioral signs, and a number of physical signs that will you think, oh no, there's reason for concern here. Might be evidence of binge eating. So the family might say, notice large quantities of food are missing, wearing baggy or layered clothing, hiding their body shape, excessive exercise, so more than expected from the training plan. It's very difficult for this individual to step away, to recover, to step off. So they exercise through injury and illness. And you might see also increased difficulty sleeping. Physical signs: bone stress injury, hormone dysfunction, frequent illness, fatigue, performance inconsistency or decline, swelling around the jaw, so the parotid gland swelling around the jaw, and that's from vomiting. Skin changes, so increase in dry skin. You might see sores and calluses on the knuckles from the individual attempting to make themselves sick. Dramatic or rapid weight loss or gain or fluctuations. Very low % of body fat for extended period of time. So what does the crossover look like? I emphasized that before. We're looking at the number, duration, and frequency of symptoms, the extent of impairment in daily function, the extent of value placed on body weight and shape and their control increases, increase in obsessionality. The relationship with physical training changes, and the individual will reflect that, like, it didn't start this way. It was about performance at the start, but then it no longer becomes performance. What becomes more important is controlling body shape and size, or some other aspect of control. It could be that it's not that the individual is trying to lose weight, it's just that the individual doesn't want to gain weight. And because they so much don't want to gain weight, it's very hard for them to be flexible around perhaps the training, and therefore what's happening is they're losing weight. And what happens then is the individual, when they arrive, they're seeing me or they're seeing the dietitian, there's a recognition that there has been a flip, and that where it was, that they perceive that they were very much in control, there's a realization that, this is no longer a choice. I am no longer in control. And you're working with somebody who's an athlete who's very upset about that. And I had the number of times I've had somebody sitting in front of me crying, saying, how did I get here? And it's a very slow process, but then the realization that, hey, even if I wanted to, it would be so stressful and so anxiety provoking to have that piece of cake. I actually feel like I don't have the choice any longer. So what we also know is that over the course of a year or competitive season, that the athlete can go up and down that continuum. So, in the off season, they can be further down and closer to the normal or optimal nutritional practices. But as they're coming into competitive season, what tends to happen is that sometimes that anxiety, that pressure, it's put on the body. What can I change? What do I have control over? And then you might see more disordered eating behavior. Or sometimes actually you might see even after the competitive season, that, okay, so I was so controlled up to that significant event. It's afterwards that you might see an increase in disordered eating behavior. So, potentially binging and purging. So that's something to also be mindful of. So I'm just going to try and play a video clip for you, see if this works. If this doesn't work, Barry, Matt, let me know, please.
It started out again with just wanting to eat healthy, and I'm not going to have desserts, or I'm not going to, but towards when I was in the worst points, it was not even, there's no way that was a rational person doing those things. I used to cut up my food into like as many different little pieces as possible, so I would only eat one, and then like hide the rest. So like my dad didn't know like I had a third of a slice of toast for breakfast and I left the other slice there. And like, so that became a thing in my head, like you can never have the full serving size, like you don't deserve to have the full slice of toast, like why? And just became so compulsive, and it was just something I did. Like the thought process just becomes more and more automatic and ingrained, and I just ended up doing things that I'm really mortified of today. And as far as my family goes, I think that has probably been like one of the, if not the most difficult thing about this experience, is just they were supportive of me. They knew I was sick, and they knew I needed to get help and treatment, and they were willing to provide that for me, like financially, whatever. They wanted me to get better more than anything. But at the same time, there was anger towards me, and I remember in those times them just saying, just fucking eat. Like, why are you putting everyone in the family stressed out? Your mom's not sleeping. Everyone's worried sick about you. Why are you so like self-absorbed that you just can't do it, and you just can't gain the weight? And I think that like that disconnect between their understanding of illness and what I was feeling was really hard.
We did have some fights, and there was, anger and screaming, but I don't know if I would describe my approach as tough love. I think maybe her dad at times, but maybe Tegan perceived it that it was that. So it was definitely a lot of anger and yelling on my part at times.
It's sometimes very easy for us as professionals, as family members, to see, all the hardship and pain that eating disorder is causing, but we don't, we're not going inside the person's head and seeing some of the benefits that they're experiencing from it, right? From our perspective, or from a parent's perspective, we see the eating disorder as the problem. The sufferer, the person who has the eating disorder, often sees the eating disorder as a solution to the problem.
Yeah, I feel a lot of guilt about what I've put my parents through, and the worry and the concern. But when you're that deep in an eating disorder, you're not thinking about how you're affecting other people. You're that sick that you're just doing what you do to get through the day.
Okay, so that's from a YouTube clip that you can find, and it's called Gain. So just this is a nice table that the Australian Institute of Sport put together in a position statement in 2020 for service providers, coaches, in terms of understanding the spectrum. And I'll just give you an example. So you might have, in terms of, one end of the continuum, normal eating, you'd have regular, stable eating patterns and energy intake is adequate. Disordered eating, that might look like short-term energy restriction, may lead to low energy availability, binging or purging. And then with an eating disorder, that would be restricting, binging, purging, often occurs several times for a week or day. Another example there, focus, in normal eating, you've got focus of purposeful exercise. It's to enhance health, fitness, and performance. The focus is not on compensating for eating. Move further up the continuum for disordered eating. The exercise may not necessarily be used to compensate for eating, but there is a consciousness that calories are being burned while exercising. And then with an eating disorder, the exercise is used to purge calories. In a normal eating, you use nutrition practices that best balance health and performance. You're not necessarily preoccupied. Disordered eating, you may be preoccupied with eating healthy or weight, but it doesn't consume the individual. It's not, oftentimes people who are further up the continuum, they just say their head, it's just that they can't stop it. It's obsessional. Their head is constantly going to the energy intake, the energy outtake. So with an eating disorder, completely preoccupied with food, eating, body shape, and weight. So I'm going to actually ask you now to go to Mentimeter again, and I'm going to put my teaching hat on, and we'll just see, if you could, I'm going to outline profiles of 3 athletes and just give you a few signs that they're exhibiting. And I want you to look at the signs on Mentimeter. If you can't read it and if it's not legible, please indicate that in the comments and I'll read them out to you. But if you could just then tell me whether or not you wouldn't be concerned at all, you would be concerned, you really would be concerned, or maybe you're just not clear. So I'm going to go to Mentimeter now. Okay. So our first young runner is Lizzie. So if you can't read the writing in Mentimeter, I can read it out for you.
Hi, Siobhain, there's a request there to read it out, please.
Okay. Yeah, so with Lizzie, she's 16 years of age. 16 years of age. She's a middle distance runner. She has, so she, she has had an injury and she has gained significant weight off of that. So I'm just see if I have, she's preoccupied, sorry, her weight gain is noticeable. She's preoccupied with healthy eating. She's a high achiever, highly self-critical, it's never good enough. She jokes after her long run that now she can eat. She always wants to do more, but her training is fairly consistent. So I'm just, just conscious of our time. So I'm going to move on now, if that's okay, to our next runner. So this is Sophie. Okay, so I'll read out Sophie as well. So Sophie, she's 24 years of age. She's longer distance, 10K plus. She's not regularly injured, but she had a hip injury earlier in the year. She came back gradually. Her weight seems to be relatively stable, very coachable, able to tell you when she's tired. So really able to sort of hone into her body and adapt her training plan, very consistent with fueling after training. Notice she's quite flexible around food. Training and performance is consistent. She's sociable. She eats out with the team. She organizes meals out for the team. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So our last runner, it's Podge. Okay, so Podge, he's 18 years of age, middle distance runner. He's had a series of injuries over the past few years, including a sacral stress fracture. He's always talking about body fat, really proud about how low it is. Always does more than outlined in the training plan and boasts about this. The lads he lives with joke about how he controls the kitchen. So he does the cooking, he ensures what goes into all the meals. He's complaining of constant fatigue and difficulty sleeping. His performance has really declined over the past couple of months. Okay. So let's go back and let's talk about these three runners. So if we take Lizzie, what are the things, what are the, the flags here? Well, we see she's 16 years of age, so she's in adolescence, which would be a high risk factor for the development of disordered eating. So what we have here is potentially she's going through puberty, and so she's probably having weight gain, potentially from puberty, but also, potentially from the injury as well. And she's preoccupied with healthy eating. So you can see that as we move up the continuum, more and more preoccupation with eating right, eating a certain way. So it's the preoccupation piece here. It's not the healthy piece, but the preoccupation piece. We know that high self-criticism is a risk factor. She jokes after her long run now that she can now eat. So we're seeing here some thinking around compensation. So, there would be definitely some concerns for Lizzie. For Sophie, I think most of you identified that you would have, she's not showing, there's no real flags there in terms of concern. And then for Podge, some real concern. Okay. So, I mean, we're not there to diagnose, we're there to flag and signpost and support. So we definitely would be concerned or highly concerned for Lizzie and Podge. So I suppose what we know is genetic loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. And then 50% of the risk of eating disorder development is attributed to the environment. So we have the general environment, and the pressures from the general environment through social media. In the 1970s, the term normative discontent was coined to talk about this pervasive discontent around, body appearance, our shape, our size, that it was pervasive now through society. In the sporting environment, we did a study in 2015 with service providers in high performance sport, just to get their attitudes and their beliefs around working with athletes who had disordered eating or an eating disorder. And so this is a quote from one of the service providers. Even in training, food is mentioned. It's a big question for athletes. What are you eating? What are you doing? What are you taking? What are you not taking? It's very rare for you to get through a session without food coming up. Okay. So what are the other pressures? So there could be, performance optimization pressure, that the belief that if I become leaner, then my performance will be optimized. Public displays of the body. So, athletes in their nicks and their lycra, very self-conscious around their body being publicly displayed. Athletic identity being hyper-competitive, so wanting to have a certain identity that they perceive is linked to their sport. Weight cycling, so wouldn't be unusual for an athlete to have a weight that they sit on the off season, and then when they're coming into the competitive season, that they're trying to move towards a more, what they would perceive a more optimal weight for competition. The contagion effect. So this is where, you see behaviors, or, you're influenced by those around you. So when you're in it, you don't realize, or you sometimes don't actually understand what's normal, what's not normal, what's healthy, is this behavior healthy? And sometimes it's the individuals who are perhaps, they're competing quite well or performing quite well, or the older athletes who have the most significant influence, but it's not necessarily a healthy or positive one. The idea of a body ideal for the sport. So, I suppose it's something to check for yourself. Like, do you believe that there is an ideal body for the event that you're involved in? I remember once going out for a run, and and joined a group of runners. And as you do, you kind of have a bit of the chat, and you talk about, how much running do you do, etc. Did you do it in your youth? And, I said to this individual that, oh yeah, no, I used to be a middle distance runner. And they looked at me and they said, ooh, you don't look like a middle distance runner. So, my head went to, oh, I wonder what they mean by that. So what it said to me was that that individual had an ideal in their head of what a middle distance runner looked like, and I didn't meet it. So if I was somebody who was further up that continuum in terms of disordered eating or eating disorder, that would be a trigger for engaging in disordered eating behavior. So criticism. What we know, what the research has shown, is that there is a link between critical comments about weight and body shape and disordered eating symptoms in individuals participating in sport. Control. We make so, in sport, there's such an emphasis around control, isn't there? Control the controllables. And, that makes sense. And, for the majority of athletes, there is a certain amount of planning, trying to do as much as you can around what you can control. But for an individual who is struggling with disordered eating, a huge component of that is around control. In fact, their challenge is letting go of control to a certain extent. So we might have an environment that very much emphasizes control. Like, it's, there's not a lot of potentially autonomy in that environment. There's not a lot of flexibility around the training plan. There's a lot of emphasis on control. You put that with a person who is also very high in control, not very flexible or adaptable, and the outcome will be, potentially very negative for health and performance. So just going to show just a little bit of this clip.
Try to convince everyone it's not just about the weight. It's not like I'm that self-absorbed that I care about this weight versus that weight, but it is about the weight at the same time, because for me, it's like the weight symbolized other parts of my identity. And so I didn't want to gain weight. It felt like I would, because it felt like I was just giving up control. It's like I was giving up, like just throwing in the towel. And like I had a fear that when I gained weight and got back to a healthy weight, I wasn't going to have the same type of drive and determination that I used to have.
I think especially.
Okay, so what are some of the tipping points? Just briefly, in terms of, when are the windows of vulnerability? So stressors are windows of vulnerability. So transition periods, and when you have a number of transition periods happening at one time, so perhaps the individual is transitioning from primary school to secondary school, or secondary school to third level. You have a transition in perhaps, they're going to third level, they're moving away from home, their friend groups are changing, perhaps there's a change in the level of training group. You have a number of stressors coming together at one time. And if I go back to that point, the functionality of disordered eating, that perhaps, the individual starts to develop a coping mechanism that's working for them in that moment, but in the long term is not functional. Injury and illness is a stressor. And another window of vulnerability for the development of disordered eating. Sometimes, we see that but I suppose not sometimes, it's a very common pattern that the individual, not intentionally, might, their body weight might have reduced through their training, and then they have their, they hit a PB. It's like a significant PB for them. And what they focus on is that they hit that time at a certain weight. So they do not remember the miles and miles of base training that they did, the fartleks, the temple runs, the hills. What they remember is that they hit that time at a certain weight. And so what they want to do then is they want to maintain that weight. So it might be not that they want to lose weight, but they don't want to gain weight. And so there's a lot of inflexibility around energy intake. And so it could be that the weight that they hit their PB at is not a healthy weight in terms of long term. So to stay at that weight over the long term could be a significant stressor on the body. So we talked about puberty being a tipping point. So any form of stress. Okay, so these can be tipping points for the development of disordered eating. Misguided dieting. Dr. Ken Goss said to me, if you want somebody to go crazy, put them on one of the fad diets where you have to be on maybe 1,500 calories a day over an extended period of time, and you'll see them go crazy. So there's so much literature to show how low calorie diets have significant implications, not just for physical health, but for mental health. So what we're looking here is it's not just the person, it's the person times the environment, and then we have, the window of vulnerabilities. So, you're concerned. So now what? What if I make things worse? What if I upset them? What if they tell their parents and their parents get upset? They're going well at the moment. No need to upset that. Keep the performance going. How do I approach them? Shit, I have no idea what to do here. And believe me, I've been in that position on many occasions in my life. So the first thing is self-awareness. So if you really want to understand how you can help the athletes, you really need to check in with yourself.
Apologies,
So
everyone.
now,
Sorry, Siobhain, I think we just lost you there for a couple of seconds.
what would be your response to that? What's the immediate response? Oh, that Canadian woman, she's mad. So we really need to check in what our own attitudes around body weight and shape are. So our beliefs influence what we do in our environment. They influence what we pay attention to. They influence what we emphasize. So our beliefs influence their beliefs. And Matt made that point at the very start. You are, I suppose I am too. We greatly influence, the young athletes that we work with. So beliefs such as absence of menstruation is normal, important to be as light as possible, one optimal weight for performance, like one number, need to be strict and controlled, always need to push the limit. So really need to check our language again, in terms of what we can do. Sometimes it's like, okay, our own self-awareness, change always begins with our own self-awareness. Check your language, check your tone, check your beliefs and own thinking patterns. So in terms of tone, just, we communicate a lot through our tone. So, a lot of what we mean to say is through the tone and through our body language and our facial expressions. So I'll give you an example. I can still remember, stepping off the track and my coach saying one word to me and my name. And he said, "Christ, Siobhain." Now that told me a lot. It was in the tone. So language, you need to get your eating right. Now, if you think about it, you might be, okay, I'm just trying to help this person, But if you think about, now that you have an understanding of the thinking patterns that underpin disordered eating and eating disorders, it tends to be very black and white. So if our language is very black and white, you know, right, wrong, clean, not clean, healthy, not healthy, it feeds into that type of thinking. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to encourage athletes, young athletes, to optimize nutrition for health and performance. But we do want some flexibility around that. You know, we really are trying to develop athletes who are, you know, flexible and adaptable. So you have had a lot of help. You should be able to change. So what is that saying to the individual? This is your fault. You can control this. No one wants to be the biggest on the line. So what does this say to the individual? You know, judgment. Is there a prioritization of weight? I suppose the way you're going, you won't be able to compete. You know, very shaming. You know, trying to shame a difficulty that is essentially shame-based. You're looking great. You're looking fit. So we tend to do this, don't we? You know, when we haven't seen somebody for a while, we might say, oh, you know, you're looking great. You're looking fit. And we tend to assume that with the loss of weight, it equals increase in fitness. And this is just very benign. We tend to do this to make people feel better. But you have to understand that in a sport environment, when there is quite an emphasis around body shape and size, that can emphasize that is something that is very important. Like, you might not mean anything by that comment, but it can reinforce, you know, the obsessionality around body weight, shape, and size. So awareness of our criticism, ours and theirs. So research shows that athletes can use self-criticism to motivate themselves, but this is linked to being less likely to achieve their goals and greater problems in recovering from setbacks. So one of the characteristics that we see in individuals with disordered eating and eating disorders is high levels of self-criticism. So we're trying to model a different way. You know, we're trying to model much more understanding and kind of trying to challenge that self-criticism. So the antidote to self-criticism and shame is compassion. So compassion, it's sensitivity to the pain, psychological and physical, that we or others experience, plus motivation and genuine commitment to relieve it. So compassionate act would be to approach a young person that you're working with if you're concerned about them, even though you feel very anxious about it, you're very worried about it, you're very worried about getting it wrong. It's, you know, you're doing something to try and alleviate the pain of somebody else, even though that might be very hard for you. So what we need really in sport and athletics is more openness, less stigma, less judgment, and more trust. So we need conversations and webinars like this evening, and we need to start talking about pressures around body weight, shape, and size, social media pressures, pressures around in peer groups, and we need to start the conversation because it tends to be something that's not really talked about. So in the research that we did with service providers, you know, the service providers saying that there is a deep-seated stigma in the sport culture in relation to body size and problematic eating behavior. So one of the service providers said, you know, they think if I go tell somebody that I have an eating disorder, that they'll stop me from running, or they'll stop me from sport, or they'll say I won't be able to take part in the team, or I suppose maybe a fear against if they do tell someone that something is going to happen. So I think we also need to, if we're doing some education with our athletes, you know, the link between some behaviors that we see as the individual is moving up up the continuum and increased body dissatisfaction. So if you think about it, you know, there's increased obsessionality around the numbers, energy in, energy out, body shape, body size, weighing. And this is fueled by apps that track energy in, energy out. And so, you know, you might suggest, oh, you know, would you just put that aside, you know, stop using that? The individual will not want to do that because that app gives them a lot of certainty, gives them a lot of control. So in the recovery process, what we're trying to do is just softly encourage them to move away from those things that are actually increasing the obsessionality around energy in, energy out. So the coaching environment we create, so lots around education. We're trying to reinforce a holistic perspective on all factors that contribute to performance. Health is a priority, and body image. We're trying to emphasize with our athletes, you know, what the body can do rather than how it looks. So a degree of self-acceptance around the body. So for an athlete who has a physical injury, you know, they come off a session and they walk over to you and they say, "Oh, the Achilles was really at me this evening." You would suggest right away, you know, go see the physio or the athletic trainer. You know, get that seen to right away. But I think when it comes to psychological difficulties, or you know, you have a sense that there is something going on and you're not quite sure, tendency towards wait and see. And if you think about that, you know, the motivation there is around like, I'm not quite sure, you know, maybe I'm not sure. But we know that it's so important to intervene early. So the longer the individual engages in behaviors, the more these are reinforced. The neuronal connections in the brain become strengthened over time. Early intervention is linked to more positive outcomes. So I suppose, you know, the other thing that's quite important is just to be able to listen. And I'm just going to share a quick story with you. So Theodore Roosevelt, former president of the United States, you know, complained to his secretary that in the long reception lines at the White House, he just felt like nobody ever listened. You know, it was just kind of like people were just on automatic. They just responded to what they thought he wanted to hear. And he said to the secretary, look, so I'm not sure if this story is true, by the way, but this is the story. He said to his secretary, look here, I'm going to try an experiment today. So for the reception line on that particular day, he goes down the reception line and he whispers in the ear of each ambassador, I killed my grandmother this morning. And the response is being, God bless you, sir. It's a pleasure to be here, sir. It's an honor to meet you, sir. Until he comes to the end of the line and he says to the ambassador of Bolivia, I murdered my grandmother this morning. And the ambassador of Bolivia whispered back, I'm sure she had it coming, sir. So the point of the story is that sometimes, you know, we're not listening. We do not, you know, we see somebody in front of us who's a high achiever, well accomplished, seems to have it all together. You know, they might be trying to tell us something and we don't hear it. So we might not hear it because our own things get in the way. I cannot tell you that I've had somebody in front of me and they told me something quite significant and I missed it because I was looking for something else, or, you know, it just didn't occur to me that this might be something that this individual might be experiencing. So the importance of listening and making the time to listen. So approaching an athlete who you are concerned about for the first time. So this is not something that, you know, you need to go and get 2 or 3 degrees on. You know, it's actually, you know, your orientation, your tone. It is all about compassion and understanding versus blame. So you can use running and training to reach them to begin the discussion. So, you know, in sport, we have, you know, that neutral territory that feels safe to the athlete. Like we can begin there. So it's not like we're emphasizing performance over health. It is just to get them on a very comfortable and stable ground. So we can broach it through that. You know, you don't seem to be yourself. How do you think things are going? You know, I'm noticing that, you know, changes to your performance. I'm concerned about you. You know, what might be helpful to you right now? I mean, I can understand that it might be difficult for you to talk about this right now, to talk about, you know, some of the challenges that you're having right now. I think you may need some additional support. What we need to do is figure out together what we can do to help you. So we let go of an agenda, we don't lecture, we don't blame, and we don't shame. So what you can expect is resistance and ambivalence. So resistance to change and to help are part and parcel of problematic eating behavior. So there can be denial of any difficulty. So why might that be? You know, so they might deny that they have any difficulty and you go into the lecture in terms of, you know, in the long term, this is going to happen. This is not going to be helpful for this individual. So typically any information that contradicts the athlete's beliefs is likely to be justified or ignored if they're further up that continuum. So why might somebody deny that there's any difficulty? Okay, so it's not that the individual is unmotivated. Rather it's what are they motivated to do? So you understand motivation. We have competing motivations here. It could be that actually the individual, on the one hand, they do want to make changes. They do want to change. They want to address the issue. But on the other hand, there's a lot of fear there. So denial of any difficulty, it comes from a place of fear. So no matter how motivated you are to change to get better, if you're more motivated to avoid pain because the pain is too hard to bear, then the disordered eating behavior and the eating disorder will trump efforts to get better. So fear underpins disordered eating and eating disorders and the thought of getting help. So, I don't really know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen to my body. I don't really know. I can't trust it. I don't know. I can't trust you. There's a lot of fear that underpins disordered eating and eating disorder behavior. There's also a lot of shame. I mean, when we work with individuals with disordered eating and eating disorder, it's the one pervasive emotion. And for a moment, I just want you to connect with shame. So I want you to think of a time in your life when you felt shame. And I don't want you to go to the most painful or shameful moment, but really connecting with that emotion. For a lot of that, for us, that will go back to school. Like I can remember 10 years old, caught for chewing gum in the class. The teacher went ballistic, put me in the corner, nose to the wall, and I felt ashamed, so ashamed. I mean, that would be over 40 years ago, and I can still feel that emotion, but I can also remember what I was thinking. I actually thought I was having a bad dream, and I just wanted the world to open up and suck me in. Shame is a horrible emotion. So if you understand that shame, a lot of individuals with disordered eating and eating disorder, they feel a lot of shame. They feel a lot of shame around their behavior. It's like, I should be able to handle this. It's just eating. Like, why can't I get over this? Or, shame in that they have a difficulty, or shame around their bodies. They describe their bodies as disgusting, and it's very visceral. It's very, it's very body felt. So if you can understand that, shame is such a core emotion in this difficulty, you think about it when you try, like I've often seen parents and coaches trying to shame somebody into motivation. You try to shame a shame-based individual, what you will get is contempt, contempt for themselves or potentially contempt for you. So that, the saying is that contempt is the soldier of shame. So, motivation. So, if you had an athlete that, you have a female athlete last season, their season best was 2:24 for the 800 meters, and they come to you and they say, this season, I want to run 2:12, very motivated, ready, willing, but they don't have the capacity yet. That. So they're not able to do that. It's the same with disordered eating and eating disorders. We send them off to somebody, and we say, look, we expect change. They may be motivated, but they may not be able. So we really, if you think about it, for that individual's coming to you and says they want to run, 2:12, you wouldn't get upset with them if that season they couldn't do it. You wouldn't blame them because you would understand that they have to build capacity. So you would have more understanding, empathy, compassion. It's the same in disordered eating and eating disorders. In the first instance, what we really need to do is we're trying to work with the individual to build their capacity. So if you think about that, the disordered eating and eating disorder potentially has some element of a function for that individual. You don't know what that is. Perhaps the individual doesn't know what that is, but they need to develop different coping mechanisms other than the disordered eating and the eating disorder. So what we really want them to do, indicators of change, is that they tell you when things are difficult, and they reach out to you rather than reach out to the disordered eating. They develop the ability to cope with painful emotions. They develop a sense of identity and self beyond their achievement in sport. They develop skills to manage strong urges. They develop self-compassion. They develop trust with their body and their physical cues, and they improve self-esteem and self-worth. So this is a nice, I picked this up from a blog by Amelia Boone, who is an American world champion obstacle course racer, and she's got a blog on her recovery process from an eating disorder. And she says sometimes that what you get isn't always what you thought you needed. And at Opal, I started to learn everything beyond just how to feed myself. I learned how to reestablish trust with my hunger after 20 years of ignoring it, and how to reestablish trust with my body after 20 years of mistrusting it. I learned that I can connect to others without the veneer of accomplishments, achievements, or admiration. I learned that it's okay to want to compete and win as long as you have other means to fill you up when that doesn't happen. I learned that it's okay to be sad and grieve when I can't engage in my sport how I'd like to, but that I can survive and thrive without it. And most importantly, I learned that it's okay and wonderful to feel my feelings. So she talks about the change. So it's not just about, she says, it's not just about, learning to feed yourself. It's about reestablishing trust with your body. It's about developing a sense of self beyond being an athlete. It's about being able to feel emotions and not being fearful around them. So the recovery process or getting better is more than just focusing on eating. But the challenge, what's the challenge? So if we address the eating, it won't sort out the psychological and emotional difficulties that underpin disordered eating and eating disorders. But we have a mind-body connection. So if you have a body that is in low energy availability, that's impacting on concentration, there's high levels of body distortion. Or if you have a body that it doesn't know if the next meal is going to be a binge or there's going to be a period of restriction, there's high levels of instability in the body. It's very hard to do the psychological work. So if we don't address the eating behavior, the psychological difficulties, the physical complications will increase. So really, for this particular mental health difficulty, it's very much a multidisciplinary approach. That's the optimal approach with this particular difficulty. So in summary, a focus on compassion, listening, education, open discussion, flexibility, and autonomy decreases risk factors for the development of disordered eating. And our Norwegian friends have shown this. They ran an intervention study over the course of a year involving athletes and coaches, a huge amount of athletes in their sport high schools. And they showed that this type of intervention, compassion, education, openness, discussion, decrease the risk factors for the development of disordered eating. There's the assumption of control is that an athlete can change their behavior. When you're further up that continuum, it's no longer a choice. So this can easily lead to frustration and anger on the part of the coach, on the part of the parents, and a sense that the athlete with disordered eating or an eating disorder is to blame for their situation. The antidote is to reorient to compassion, empathy, as you would do towards an athlete who is injured. Addressing problematic eating behavior requires a focus not just on eating, but also on the psychological difficulties that underpin the eating behavior. So. So I told you I would go over an hour, and I definitely did. So just perhaps, if there's any questions there.
Thanks very much, Siobhain. That was superb. There's some really good questions there. I realised, actually, I forgot that some people didn't join us on the first workshop, so I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Matthew Lockett from the High Performance Team at Athletics Ireland, my National Endurance Coordinator. And I think one of the things that Siobhain picked up on all through that talk was really the link between health and performance, and really the two go hand in hand. We're always thinking about performance, but if your athlete in front of you is not healthy, you're really you're trying to build a house on shaky foundations. So it's great to have so many people tuned in. So that was some really good questions. One there I saw from Ian that often comes up amongst coaches, is there a point where a coach should draw the line between trying to help an athlete and getting to the point where they say, I can't help you anymore, and just putting their hands up and saying, this is the end of the line.
Yeah, and I can see that. I can understand how Ian, understandable being very frustrated, because I can imagine that you've tried very hard to support the athlete, and perhaps the athlete has reassured you that they will change, and I can understand how that would be very frustrating for you. I suppose, without, just understanding that their engagement in sport is probably another coping mechanism and very, very important to them. So, you could, if you say, okay, I can't help you anymore, or you can't run anymore, you're almost cutting them off at the knees. And sometimes individuals, they keep pushing you away and pushing you away to see if you'll stay. So I suppose my response to that is just to keep with the athlete, to keep going with the athlete, and even small steps. So, how can I support you in terms of, let's one little step, and like, we can go and see, and perhaps encourage them to see the GP or see a nutritionist. You don't necessarily have to do anything after that. That's just the first step. Or, but my advice would be, if you're a key support for that individual, to keep going with that individual. And I know it's really hard, and parents, coaches say this, that actually one of the hardest things is maintaining hope and keep going and keep running with the individual. Like, it takes a lot of energy. It's very taxing, and you too have to take care of yourself and have compassion for yourself. It's almost like you have to put the oxygen mask on you, if you're going to be able to put it on the athlete. So there's some self-compassion in terms of how difficult it also is for you, and perhaps the partner and the parents, because it actually is typically a longer road in terms of the recovery process. And sometimes we think, it can be quite quick, and that's not the case.
Thanks very much. That's a great answer. Yeah, I think you touched on it a little bit in the as the presentation went on, but there's a question around there: is how do you approach that initial conversation, and maybe what you do first? When you start to really have a concern about an athlete, might be worth recapping.
Yeah. So, it's again, I suppose it's the orientation. So it's the approach. So I can understand it's very, very scary, because you're not sure and you're afraid that you're going to do harm. And, it's almost it's a very difficult situation, because you're probably going to be received with, pushback. But, the individual will say down the road, well, they didn't really care about me. Like, they didn't even ask, they didn't notice, they didn't seem to, nobody said anything. So on the one hand, it's a pushback. And on the other hand, they actually want you to notice, they are looking for help on one level. So I suppose that first initial, where you're first touching upon it, it's kind of, as I said there, that it's with compassion, it's with understanding. Like, I notice, some of these changes, you don't seem to be yourself, the performance is up and down. You might even notice, like I've noticed, you're like I have noticed that there's been a change in weight. I'm concerned about you. We can look at this. You're looking at, you're not sort of, there's no accusation there. There's no blame. There's concern. The bridge is, the way in is something that is, you have to, the hook in is something that's important to the individual. And, you have the hook in is performance in sport. So really care about you, really concerned about you. You're very important. Want to see if we can do everything we can to support you. I'd like you to go and see your GP. I think that would be really important. What else can I do to support you? Perhaps we need to put some other supports around you. So that's the starting point, and to see how the individual responds to that.
I'm just thinking, I guess with COVID, when we get back training, we might still be very conscious of social distancing. But even on our typical club training nights, I don't know what it's like down at Raheny, but you might have athletes that just turn up to you for training 2-3 times a week. How would you have any thoughts on how you physically have that conversation? Do you do it at the club night? Do you try and steer them away from that? Do you have a phone call?
Yeah, no, and it is tough, isn't it? In that, because typically you see that the interactions are just casual, aren't they? They're after the session, as you're picking up the stakes, you see the trickle of the athletes coming to you maybe one by one, or, you might say, do you fancy, going for a warm down together or cool down, so like cool down together. So you're trying to keep it casual, and, rather than make it something that, you're going to call the athlete and have a conversation about. It might be, You know, after the session, do you have time to, I know they're still in COVID, but, you know, if you had a time for a cup of tea, or let's walk back to the parking lot together. You're trying to keep it as casual as possible. So not the face-to-face confrontation, because not confrontation, but face-to-face conversation, because that could be, you know, it could be very difficult for the individual. The more casual it is, you know, and you're just starting, you know, you're just starting that conversation, that process. So you want the individual to kind of feel as safe as possible and not defensive.
Yes, around
Sorry, Matt, you're on mute there.
sorry.
Yeah.
A lot of coaches make coach, they might male coaches even coaching young females, you know, 16 to 18. Is it a conversation you want to have on your own because of the nature of it, or is it better to have someone there? What's the...
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's kind of how it's done, isn't it? Because I can understand that, you know, come back, have a walk back to my car with me, you know, not necessarily, but it's, you know, you can sort of have where you might ask them to come and pick up the stakes with you. So you're kind of, you know, you're moving away from the group, but you're still visible to the entire group, and you're walking around. Or, you know, would you mind, you know, I just want to talk to you about how things are going for you. Would you mind coming a little bit earlier? You know, there's athletes warming up, you know, and maybe you walk around with them. Ideally, actually, you would be after, because before it might be too upsetting, but after, you know, just casually, where there's other athletes there still cooling down, and, you know, you get them to, you know, perhaps help you pick up the stakes, or you might, you know, yeah, so you're visible to other athletes as well.
I can go through a few more questions that have come through, Siobhain. Okay, great. So does the constant expectation of achieving in their discipline play out in their taking control of eating if their success is not happening as an athlete?
So I suppose, you know, that's around, you know, the pressure, isn't it? Perceived pressure, and pressure is a stressor. So we're looking at, so a number of things there. We're looking at the combination of perhaps perceived pressure, the pressure that they're putting on themselves in terms of personality characteristics, you know, wanting to achieve really high, you know, wanting to achieve and not being able to do that. And then how they see how they can actually achieve that. So oftentimes what happens is that, you know, low self-esteem, dissatisfaction with the self-criticism, you know, what the individual does is they're trying to change something that's physical to address an internal problem. So you're trying to change your body in some way, or you're trying to manage those difficult emotions in some way through control. You're trying to do those things. So there's kind of like external things that you're trying to do to address more of an internal difficulty. So you can see how, like, there's no one route. You know, you can't see like A plus B equals C, and that's why that happened. There's many different routes and many different factors. It's just having an awareness of that. Certainly pressure, stress, external, pressure, stress, internal, personality characteristics, dissatisfaction with the self can play out into self-criticism, which then plays out into behaviors, and then plays out perhaps into disordered eating behaviors. So we can see that, how that would work, that might happen.
Okay, up next, would you recommend sharing resources like that of Amelia Boone with an athlete you know has an eating disorder?
Well, I suppose sharing a resource without having a conversation about it in the first instance, or, you know, I think that that's, you know, there's an elephant in the room, and you're not addressing it. So, you know, you might have that initial conversation where, you know, I'm concerned about you. I know that it might be difficult to talk about what's going on for you, because, you know, perhaps it's very scary, or, you know, you might feel very anxious about it. You know, if there's anything that I can do to support you, you know, there's, you know, and I suppose that's where I would start before actually going to sharing resources, if you actually haven't had the conversation. Because if the person is in complete denial, and they don't think there's a problem, and you share those resources, it can, you know, push them back even further. You know, it can be, you know, even evoke like an anger response. So we really need to have the discussion in the first instance, some recognition around it by the individual, and then perhaps helping them by sharing resources.
Thank you. Okay. Any recommendations on how to guide the conversation with an athlete that is disclosing that they have disordered eating, binging and purging, and body image concerns?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the first instance, so I mean, if the athlete is disclosing that to you, I have to say for that individual, they really trust you. And, the fact that this person can share that with you, that is phenomenal. I think it's a real testament to you as a coach, but also what it takes for that individual to disclose that to you. So typically that first point of contact is so critical. And there's really the first piece there is the empathy and the understanding. Thank you for sharing that with me. I can understand how difficult that was, and I can really understand that the anxiety perhaps coming and talking to me about this, because I can understand it's a very difficult area and not many people talk about it. So thank you. And then asking, what do you think you need? What can I do to help? And if they say, look, I'm not sure, it's like, okay, well, what we really need to do is to support you. You deserve that. And the first step really would be going to your GP. And we're just going to take it in very small steps, because you can, for this individual, the thought of the recovery process can be very overwhelming. So we're just trying, how to do this as coaches, step by step, micro steps, that it's not overwhelming. We're just going to see what the GP says. I'm going to see if the GP has any resources. I'm going to see if we can access, perhaps at that stage, I would actually signpost them also to Bodywhys and your resources.
Thank you. So the next question is, how do you approach the situation if the person is a minor? Do you speak to their parents first?
Yeah. So if they're a minor, yes, I mean, you have a duty of care, and with a minor, I would certainly, approach the parents and just say that you have a concern, and to talk it again. It depends on how the parent receives it, but I think that then you might ask if all three of you can actually talk to the minor together, or perhaps that's too much. Maybe in the first instance, it's getting the parent to actually approach the minor, but certainly, you have a duty of care to actually talk to the parents. Because again, I can't, reinforce enough that the longer it goes on, the more difficult it is to address. And if we can intervene early, that's the best approach.
Okay, we have a couple more here in the chat. How regular should contact, conversations, or check-ins be then when trying to support the person through their change? Is the ball in their court?
Mm-hmm. And I think, next week, there's going to be more in the webinar next week. There's going to be more around, management, what the coach can do to support the athlete. But I suppose it's like, it's kind of like, in the very basic level, it's psychological first aid, in that what we're trying to do is provide the individual with support. So the fact that, what we want to do is check in to see how they're doing. It's not necessarily asking them, have you eaten, or how's the recovery going? It's a concern around the person. So extending the hand, the compassion, the empathy, being there for the individual, because what we really want the individual to do is what they have been doing is they've been reaching to the disordered eating and the eating disorder, and we need them to reach out to people who want to support them. That's really one of the big first steps. So, connecting with them, asking them how they're doing. You do not necessarily have to ask them how the recovery process is going, but showing genuine concern for the person is really important.
So how do athletes find a balance between eating well, having dessert, and having a body you are happy with when you are 18?
Yeah. So I suppose there's, so eating well, having dessert, and having a body that you're happy with. So what I hear there is that having dessert perhaps will lead to not having a body that you're happy with. And, you know, this kind of the thinking around that. So, you know, as, you know, just to understand that having a dessert, you know, today, in terms of, you know, if you are a regular eater and a normal eater, you know, the implications for that in terms of weight gain or body fat in 2 weeks' time is minimal. The implications of that, you know, in a competition in a month's time, it's nothing. So there is something there around like I can't, because if I do, you know, I'm never going to have this perfect body. So it's around, I suppose it's around the expectations of the body, it's around the rules of the body. But, you know, if there's what we know in terms of disordered eating behavior and eating disorders, we know from the research looking at dieting that there is something also around psychological deprivation. So if you tell yourself you can't have something, you know, you want it. So, you know, it almost sets you up saying that you can't have it. It almost sets you up for more obsessive thinking around wanting it, and then potentially disordered eating behavior. So what we're trying to encourage is really flexibility around eating, and also more acceptance around body shape and weight and size. So I'm sort of curious there around, you know, what is the optimal or perfect body, because oftentimes people believe that when they have that optimal perfect body, so these are beliefs that are very common in disordered eating and eating disorder, then they will be happy. When they have the optimal perfect body, that's when they'll perform well. When they have the optimal perfect body, that's when they're going to have confidence and people were going to start to like them. And they're, you know, so it's kind of, there are a lot of beliefs that kind of underpin the behavior.
I think as a coach, it's an interesting one to think about your own real beliefs, and really scrutinize. Do you actually have preconceived ideas about what an athlete in a particular event group should look like? I know if I'm deeply honest, I know I think I've been victim of having those preconceived ideas, even at a subconscious level, even though you know, quite aware of this topic and want to avoid it. You still do, you know, you still think that, oh, that athlete looks like a middle distance athlete, for example. It's something you can find yourself thinking. So it's something I think coaches need to challenge the thinking a little bit more. So it's a good point. I think I'm conscious that it's getting late, and I think we've, as Siobhain said, we've got the final session is going to be a multidisciplinary panel after an athlete comes on and gives their perspective. So there's a chance to really zone in on what you can do as a coach at the various stages, from prevention to early intervention, which Siobhain stressed is so important, through to helping out in the more advanced stages of eating disorders or disordered eating. But I think I'd like to say a big thank you to Siobhain. I've watched quite a lot of webinars over the last 12 months, and there was a very complicated topic tonight, which I thought was delivered with real clarity. So big thanks to Siobhain. That was excellent from my perspective as a coach. So we'll send out a big thanks to Bodywhys for helping string us together on Sport Island. We'll send out resources and a copy of a link to the video in the coming days. So hope lots of you can join us for the third workshop.
I could just add a concluding note to agree with you, Matt. And I think for anyone who's tuning in tonight, if you're new to disordered eating and eating disorders, hopefully you've seen that they're about much more than food, and that they are not a lifestyle choice, that they're not about attention seeking, and they're not about vanity. If you do any reading at all in the area, you will see there is an enormous personal cost to the person and also to their family. And in the athlete world, then that's as much off the track as it is off the track. And I was very struck by the language as well. And in my experience, people use very provocative language. They talk about it as a vicious cycle, as a bully, a monster, a dictator. So if you're hearing that, you know, it's very insightful when people talk about their personal experience of an eating disorder. And one piece I would add around the shame issue is that there's a pejorative that people with eating disorders are manipulative, and that's really not helpful to put that on someone, and it just heightens that sense of blame. The reality is it's the illness that manipulates the person by lying to them, unfortunately, and that's what we hear on Bodywhys support services. So thank you very much for everyone for tuning in this evening, and to Siobhain and Matt.
Thanks. Good evening, guys.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.